Hey, hello there. Welcome. I'm Jeff Antonellis-Lapp, and if you're watching this presentation, then I imagine it's because Ranger Kurt at Mount Rainier has asked you or told you to do so. And that probably also means that you'll be working at Mount Rainier National Park this summer, which is terrific. Good for you and congratulations. I know the 2 summers that I worked at Mount Rainier were great summers and really changed me in a good way. So I'm sure you're going to have a great season. He's asked me to take you on a virtual field trip this afternoon, and we're going to do that from my natural history of Mount Rainier National Park, Tahoma, and its people. That was published this spring by Washington State University Press. So let's get started. You probably already know that Tahoma is one of several Native American words to describe Mount Rainier, but there's no universal agreement on what the word means. Maybe where the waters begin or White Mountain. Some experts think that it just referred to any snow-covered peak. And as for the people in the title, I wanted to reflect the folks that have had relationships with Mount Rainier or that have relationships with Mount Rainier today, and beginning with the Native Americans who started going up to Mount Rainier over 9,000 years ago, all the way up to today's people. Folks like you and me who know and love the mountain, people of all ages, all abilities, all interests, all colors, all nationalities, all people. And I have to tell you that before I even began the work on the book, tribal folks on the reservations at Nisqually and Muckleshoot and other places welcomed me onto their lands. I was there to teach, but honestly, I think I learned more from them than I ever taught. But because of their kindness, I was able to study the language of the Puget Sound country, Hulshutseed. Chuff, siaya. Chuff, siaya. Hello, friend. And tribal elders, they shared cultural knowledge with me. And I learned how to gather cedar bark, how to work with it a little bit. And these gifts prepared me to learn about and to write about the presence of their ancestors at Tahoma over the ages. The other people that I want to recognize are folks with the National Park Service, particularly park scientists and other staff at Mount Rainier National Park. These folks invited me onto glaciers to help take measurements. They drugged me up into alpine lakes that didn't even have established trails, didn't even have names, and taught me how to survey for amphibians. I also learned how to look through soils, trying to find stone tool artifacts. These and other projects, so many things that just added to the richness of my research. And their standard trick, you got to be careful with these park employees. Their standard trick was they would meet me at the trailhead and they would say, oh, hey, Jeff, by the way, can you carry this? And they would usually give me a piece of really heavy equipment to schlep for the entire day. So what Kurt has asked me to talk about and to lead you on is a field trip in the Nisqually watershed. So this is a shot of the upper watershed from the Rick Secker Point area, and we're looking up toward the mountain. You can see the Nisqually riverbed in the foreground. You can see the Nisqually Bridge crossing the river there. And you can think of our talk today, our trip today, as kind of like something from, we're going to travel from Alpine Heights to the Salish Sea, or if you want to think of it in terms of organisms, you can say we're going to travel from the mountain goats down to the land of the gooey ducks. All right, so let's get started. Let's take a look at the watershed first. And as I said, we'll begin at the terminus of the Nisqually Glacier. So we'll see where the river actually begins. And then we'll follow the river about 78 miles all the way down until it runs out into Puget Sound at the Billy Frank Jr. Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge. Now, we ought to begin with the people. The first people, the Squaliopsh, the Nisqually people, people of the grass, people of the river, who have lived in this watershed since time immemorial. Now, there aren't any records of Muckleshoot ancestral villages inside present park boundaries, but there appears to have been a village in what would be today's Skate Creek area. There was also a village near Elby. There was a large important village below the LeGrand and Alder dams. The village at Michelle, where the Michelle River empties into the Nisqually, was important for a number of reasons. One of which that it was the home village of Leschi, who was a renowned leader and war strategist for the Nisqually people. Also, this village on Muck Creek, also called Dog Salmon Creek, is significant because it was the birthplace of Willie Frank. And he was a cultural bridge between the 19th and 20th century. His time that he spent talking to ethnographers and other experts really painted so much of the picture of Native life as he was a child and a young boy growing up. Really important information that Willie Frank helped bring forward. And then a couple of villages on either side of the river mouth down at the Nisqually Delta. Now, what we do know about inside the park is that there's at least one really important site, an archaeological site that was probably used by Nisqually tribal people. We figure for over 7,000 years. This is an area that's near Indian Henry's hunting ground, if you've ever been there. And in fact, this site is just off the Couts Creek Trail on the way up to Indian Henry's. And the couple of things that are important here, well, I should tell you first that why did Native people come? Well, they came here principally to access resources that they didn't have near their lowland villages. So folks would come up here in the summertime after the snows had melted back, and they would pick berries, huckleberries. They would gather bear grass and other important plants. They would hunt animals up here. So they would set up camp, often in family groups, spend some days up here, gather the resources that they had collected and gathered and hunted, and then go back down to their lowland villages. But the other important things here that I want to point out to you is that, first of all, the expert, then park archaeologist Greg Burchard, who is in the unit, he appears to be the only person who's doing the work. Can you see that? And the rest of us, including yours truly, are standing around with hands on hips. But Greg was so important to the development of the park's archaeological record. His project in 1995, where he surveyed several thousand acres of the park on foot, added 32 sites to the park's archaeological record. Another photo from that site in the background here is present park archaeologist Ben Diaz, who continues to work with local tribes and continues every summer with projects to extend and grow the park's archaeological record. Here's a sample, a smattering of some stone tool artifacts that have been recovered at some of the other sites at Mount Rainier, blades, scrapers, projectile points. Here's a close-up of a projectile point. And what we should keep in mind is that most of the finds at Mount Rainier are really just slivers of stone, no bigger than your pinky fingernail. This was a stone material that was brittle, it broke easily, and so tools often needed to be resharpened or reworked completely. And so in many cases, what's found is the stone tool debris from tooling that's left behind. So we've had a little bit of look at that, learned a little bit about the people of the watershed. So let's begin our trip down the watershed and let's go take a look at the Nisqually Glacier. The first thing we should notice here is this huge U-shaped valley that's been carved out by the Nisqually Glacier. And the next time you're out at the Nisqually Vista Trail right here and looking up at the mountain, try to imagine this valley filled from rim to rim with ice and snow, hundreds of feet deep. And the same was true over the ages down at Longmire, all the way out, hundreds of feet deep, ice and snow, all the way out to Ashford and beyond. So here's a little closer look at the glacier. This is exactly where the river begins. Let's get a close-up of it. So here you see the Nisqually River coming out from underneath the glacier. And even though that looks like rock, that is the Nisqually Glacier, the terminus or the tongue, covered up by rock debris. Now, I would probably be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about the status of the Nisqually Glacier and the glaciers at Mount Rainier in general. So just a quick side trip. Take a look at this drawing of the years that represent the approximate location of the terminus of the Nisqually Glacier. Okay, let's dig deeper. For example, I was born in 1954. That would have placed the terminus of the glacier about here-ish when I was born. And using the scale at the bottom, you can see that in my lifetime, the glacier has retreated a mile or more up valley. Now, the bigger story is that the Nisqually has retreated over 2.5 miles since the mid-1800s. And I think the big takeaway is that all of the mountain's 20-some glaciers are at their historic minimums. They've retreated the furthest up the mountainside ever since record keeping began. So when you bump into park geologist Scott Beeson this summer, make sure you ask him about glacial retreat at Mount Rainier, and he's done some terrific recent studies, and he can just fill your head with even more great information about the status of the glaciers at Mount Rainier. But to clinch this idea of glacial retreat, look at this photograph. Take a look at this. Notice the glacial extent here, side to side, and the coming down at you, and use this star as your point of reference. Now I'm going to show you a photograph taken from the exact same location a little more than 100 years later, here. So take another look from here to here. Pretty dramatic, don't you think? Yeah, I do too. So let's transition. Let's go take a look at the Paradise Meadows. Those are about 1 mile southeast of the terminus of the glacier. And well, the Paradise Meadows, for many people, these are the big ticket attraction. One study showed that half the people that come to Mount Rainier come to see the wildflowers. This is one of the most spectacular shows of wildflowers in the entire world, and people come from all over to see them in the summertime. The superstars, some of them of the meadows, are probably the subalpine lupin that you see in the background here, and then in the foreground, one of the several species of paintbrush. And did you know that lupin comes from the Latin word lupus for wolf, and people mistakenly believe that lupin robbed nutrients from the soil, when actually, as a member of the pea family, and like all legumes, lupins actually add nutrients like nitrogen to the soil. And as far as paintbrush is concerned, did you know that the flowers of paintbrush are actually green? Yeah, those colors, the crimsons and scarlets and the beautiful colors, are actually a modified leaf called bracts. Check it out the next time that you're up in the meadows and they're in bloom. So there's some other news up in the Paradise subalpine parklands, and that's that researchers from the University of Washington are finding that the wildflowers are blooming earlier and staying in bloom for longer periods of time than in previous years. Now, this would be good news for visitors, but this is not such good news for the plant and animal communities. When you keep in mind that there's a very tight, well-organized sequence pollinating between the wildflowers and bumblebees, other insects, the 2 species of hummingbirds that are found in the meadows. And if these things get out of whack, it could have some long-term effects on the plants and animals that aren't so good. Well, if we're talking paradise, of course, we have to also talk about our good friend, the hoary marmot. Now, I think that if marmots were furniture, they would probably be a lazy boy recliner. Did you know that they hibernate for 7 months out of the year, and that they spend 80% of their lives underground in their burrows? But when they're up like this, sunning on a rock, these little lumps, lovable, are photogenic, aren't they? And folks just love them. So people have been drawn to paradise for over 100 years for the beauty of the flower fields, the marmots and other wildlife, and the incredible view from there. And all of these things have come at a great cost. And the cost is a substantial human impact on the subalpine ecosystem at Paradise. For example, there was a downhill skiing operation for over 40 years. There was a tent camp business where you could rent a canvas tent and camp in the meadow as part of your vacation. There was even a short-lived 9-hole golf course at one point. But probably some of the biggest damage, in addition to hikers and people taking shortcuts and setting up camps where they shouldn't have set up camps, probably the other biggest damage to the meadows came from the pony rides. And even many years after the rides had stopped, they left trenches 2 feet deep and about 10 feet wide. So here's the good news. All those human impacts launched a long series of really great restoration projects and success stories. And let's take a quick look at a couple of those. For example, one is revegetation projects that take place every year that allow park visitors like these folks to volunteer, deepen their relationship with Mount Rainier, and feel like they're stewards of a national park. So whether it's National Public Lands Day on the last Saturday in September or any of the other events through the summer, people have an opportunity to do this and really make a difference in revegetating the meadows at Mount Rainier. Another outgrowth of the research projects and the things that we've learned along the way is the Meadow Rovers program. Park staff eventually realized that the best way to keep people on the trails and off the meadows was the presence of uniformed personnel. So these volunteers, the Sunrise area and the Paradise area, every summer are interacting with park visitors in a good way, helping them understand what it means to leave no trace and to stay on the trails and to do the best for the subalpine parklands. So let's start to take a look down the watershed a little bit. Let's move down from Paradise. And as we're driving down, just above the Cougar Rock campground, there's a nice big asphalt pull-off on the right. We can take that, get out of the car, carefully cross the road and walk over to where Van Trump Creek comes down and empties in to the Nisqually River. Now, a normal process of creeks and rivers that flow off of mountains is that they carry sediment, and that this sediment tends to accumulate in the riverbeds. This is called aggradation. Like I said, a normal ecological process at Mount Rainier proceeded pretty gradually over most of the 20th century, about 4 inches per decade. But then in a 10-year period, at the end of the 20th century, things got crazy. Measurements showed that aggradation had increased on average to about 36 inches in some places in a 10-year span. So that's an increase by a factor of 9. Wow. So why the big increase? Well, if you think about the upper mountain with ice and snow on it, and as that material up there starts to deteriorate, melt, and break up, that's going to allow greater quantities of glacial moraines and other rock material to be movable, to move downslope. And that's exactly what's happened here at Van Trump Creek in a series of debris flows, or technically they could be called glacial outburst floods in some cases. But when this road was built over 100 years ago, you see the car there on the roadway, 38 feet above the creek bed. That's no longer the case. So with the creek bed higher now, this area is going to hold less water, and it's going to have a higher likelihood of overtopping and even potentially damaging the road. Now, a classic example of this flooding as a result of aggradation was, here we are now down at Longmire. This was in the flood of 2006. In November of that year, the park picked up 18 inches of rain in a 36-hour period. And it was so crazy, it almost washed the park's emergency operations center down the Nisqually River. That would have made the news. So while we're in Longmire, the other thing that we should probably make sure that you know here, of course, is that Longmire gets its name from James Longmire and the family who had a mineral bath operation in the Longmire area for a number of years. Longmire Medical Springs, they eventually had some rooms, some hotels, a Longmire Springs Hotel that was built there. And people would come mostly from Seattle and the Tacoma area to come and recreate and to rest in the mineral baths, the water that was in the meadows. So the other thing here at Longmire that's of interest, make sure that we know that this was the original park headquarters. This is now called the Longmire Wilderness Information Center. And the next time you're over there, check it out and notice the incredible architecture. Mount Rainier is a special park in the Park Service system in so many ways. And one of them is that it was one of the first to use this kind of architecture that's called Park Service Rustic. Notice the big open, the big beams and the big timbers that are used, and the rock material on the facing of the building. This is a classic that was instituted at Mount Rainier. And check it out also at the Longmire Community Building, another really great example of Park Service Rustic. So as we move out from Longmire, I want to show you just one more example of the damage of the 2006 flood. We're really close to the Nisqually entrance now. Here's the road was wiped out. Most of the Sunshine Point campground and picnic area were washed down the Nisqually River in just a tremendous torrential downpour and flooding event. Closed the park for 6 months as crews scrambled to repair over $20 million worth of damage. So let's get ready and leave the park. Let's move on out a little bit, but before we do, let's take one more stop, and that is, in addition to these aggradation events where sediment accumulates in riverbeds, can cause increased flooding possibilities, the other thing that happens high on the mountain as much of this snow and ice deteriorates is that large quantities of rock material can break away suddenly and release, as I mentioned at Van Trump Creek, as debris flows. And these are happening with an increased frequency. Since the 1960s, over 30 of them, and many of them have occurred on Tahoma Creek. Now, this was once a pretty narrow little creek, but now you notice how wide and braided it is. And the park leadership was getting concerned that the Tahoma Creek was getting wider and wider, and it looked like it might even just swallow up the West Side Road. So they decided to try a pilot project. And what they did was they brought in excavators, and you see this one is actually sitting on the West Side Road here. The creek would be to your left in this photograph, and dug out next to the road and prepared and then installed several huge engineered log jams. Now, these things are terrific at controlling erosion and flooding. They can even slow down the flow of a creek or river, allow it to drop its sediment load. As that accumulates on the riverbed, that can change the grade of the bed. And the hope is actually that the river or creek can then actually move away from something that they need to protect, in this case, the West Side Road. So there was a couple of other things that they did here at this site. Crews also came in with an idea for a bioengineering project. And what they did was they installed woven mats of red alder and Sitka willow, hoping that they would take root and eventually help to hold the soils in place. So the next time you're up the West Side Road, this is about a mile above the Dry Creek Gate, okay? Check this out. It's a really, really neat project to take a look at. All right, well, now I think we're probably ready to move down the watershed. Let's leave the park. And as we do, let's make sure on our way to Eatonville, let's make sure that we notice the Mount Rainier Gateway Project, where over 2,500 acres of really varied habitat is being protected in perpetuity. And let's also notice the Nisqually Community Forest, where thousands of acres are being preserved in the state's largest community-owned forest. Now, these two projects are part of the work of the Nisqually Land Trust. They're one of the key organizations in the watershed, and they have preserved over 7,500 acres in the watershed, protected from development, and they've also preserved 75% of the Nisqually River shoreline from any kind of potential development. They're a big partner with the Nisqually River Council. And the Nisqually River Council is the oldest watershed council west of the Mississippi. And because of their broad membership, their great leadership, and their collaboration with so many partners, they have just done a wonderful job of preserving and restoring so many different places in the watershed. So come along, I want to show you just a couple of these projects. So here we are outside of Eatonville at a spot called Ohop Creek. This was one of the first and kind of the signature projects between the Nisqually Indian tribe and a number of their partners. When farmers came in here in the late 1800s, their idea was to take the meanders out of Ohop Creek, straighten it, make it faster, drain the area so that they would have a successful dairy farm operation. And it worked for them, but it was deadly for the salmon runs. And so what the tribe and its partners did was they re-engineered this area and restored the historic meanders, slowed the creek down, put in log jams like the one you see here in the foreground to allow good places for salmon to rest, hide out from predators, feed. And then across the way, you see all those white tubes. Those are actually a protective casing for the native plants, thousands and thousands of which have been planted by volunteers, many of which are now tall enough to provide shade at Ohop Creek to cool the water and hence making even better conditions for migrating salmon. Just a little ways down near at Eatonville still, but near Smallwood Park, more log jams have put in there again to control flooding, erosion, and to provide great habitat for migrating salmon. So let's get ready to move from Eatonville. Here we are, and we're going to go down and check out most of the way down the watershed. We're going to check out just an amazing, completely different ecosystem. And of all places, it happens to be on a military base. So we're going down to Joint Base Lewis McChord, where the US Army and the Air Force share a base. And there, believe it or not, is some of the most rare and precious habitat in North America. This is called you might call this an oak prairie meadow. Anyway, just a beautiful area. And at one point, there was over 300 miles of prairies all the way down into Oregon. And today, what remains is only about 3%. So obviously, the idea is to preserve and protect the remaining prairies as much as possible. And you might think, well, what would be the best way to do that? What would be the best way to preserve a prairie oak ecosystem? Well, when you consider that the size has damaged the hopes of so many plants. For example, there's something like 46 species of prairie plants are listed as endangered or threatened. Over half of the bird species have either had a reduction in their population, their range has been reduced, or they've been extirpated entirely. So the stakes are high to preserve this. What would be the best way to do that? Well, it might not be what you think, but believe it or not, it's by shelling. A lot of the prairie is on an artillery range, and one of the best things that you can do is to provide frequent low-intensity fires that these native plants really thrive on. Plus, you're not developing the area, so that's going to be a good thing for the prairies as well. So there's a number of projects that are aimed at individual species at JBLM on the prairies. Let's take a quick look at a couple of them. Here's the Taylor's checker spot butterfly. At one time, they were abundant on prairies, and now they exist at fewer than a dozen locations. But the restoration efforts have really focused on rearing and breeding these individuals in captivity. And in a remarkable partnership between the Washington Department of Corrections and the Evergreen State College, a program called the Sustainability in Prisons Project enables incarcerated people to work with the butterflies, and they've raised over 18,000 larvae and Taylor checker spot butterflies that are later released onto the Nisqually prairies. When I visited the rearing facility, one of the incarcerated people there told me that she said, it makes me feel alive to work here. It makes me feel like we're saving their lives and they're improving ours. She looked at me and she said, it makes me feel like the best is yet to come for them and for us. I thought that was pretty powerful. There's another neat story here going on the prairies, and that happens to be the streaked horned lark. Now, I see horned larks, a different subspecies, up on the mountain frequently every year, especially in late summer. But the streaked horned lark is really in trouble on the prairies. And what researchers are doing is they're going down to other prairies in Oregon, stealing eggs, a clutch of eggs, bringing them up to JBLM and trying to trick the parents into raising young that they did not lay those eggs. And it's actually working because, and what it does is it helps increase the genetic diversity in the horned lark population, and it gives them a chance that they might recover on the prairies. Now, the other thing that goes on in these prairie projects is looking at attempting to restore the prairie at a system-wide level, beyond just working with individual species. And so let's take a look at a couple of those projects. Here's the beast of the prairies. You are probably familiar, if you live in this region, with Scots broom, also called Scotch broom. This is a nasty invasive plant that was introduced on Vancouver Island in 1850. One shrub has thousands of seeds, and these guys are just almost impossible to eradicate completely. One method is to mow and mow and mow, but another way that's really effective is prescribed burns. And this helps restore ecological function. It removes the invasives like Scotch broom and others. And as I said, many native plants in the prairie respond favorably to low intensity fires. And in fact, Native American people knew this and used fires to control some of the growth on the prairies. So prescribed burns like this, crews have burned about 1,800 acres per year on average in the last decade. And this helps the Gary oak, camas, other important plants. And it helps control some of the invasives like broom or unwanteds like Douglas fir. Even though it's a native plant, it doesn't, what it does to the prairies is it takes over. So these and other projects are restoring the prairie oak ecosystem. And in another really great venture here, cooperation between Washington Department of Corrections, one more time, with the Sustainability in Prisons Project, these incarcerated people raise native plants that are then planted out into the prairies at Nisqually. In their greenhouse program, incarcerated people have raised over 2.5 million plants and have figured out how to raise over 80 different species of native plants in a nursery for the first time anywhere. And one of the plants that they raise is harsh paintbrush. This is a prairie native, and this is a cousin of the paintbrush that you will see up at Mount Rainier in Paradise when it's in bloom. So why don't we go ahead and take our last stop. Let's go from where we are right now on the prairies. Let's make a little hop down to the estuary of the Nisqually River. Here's what it looks like. So we're looking north. You've got Interstate 5 in the foreground. Olympia would be to your left in about 10 miles, and to your right would be Tahoma, starting at about 15 miles or so. All right. These estuaries, where fresh and saltwater mix, are extremely rich, important ecosystems that support millions of organisms. And this is one of the best examples of salt marsh habitat that remains in this corner of the world. So if we were to take a look at the Nisqually River Delta through the ages, we might think of it back thousands and thousands of years ago as something that would have been close to being in its natural condition. and then native villages that came to live on either side of the river mouth. And then in the mid-1800s, European American settlers started to move into the area. And then on a rainy, miserable day in December in 1854, signatories from the Nisqually, Puyallup, Squaxin, and other tribal groups, they signed the Treaty of Medicine Creek, and they ceded 4,000 square miles of land to the federal government. And they reserved the right to hunt and fish and gather in their usual and accustomed locations. And this continued until the early 1900s, when a lawyer from Seattle, Elson Brown, had the idea to start a large-scale farming operation. And so one of the first things that Mr. Brown did was he hired a crew to come out and build a 5-mile dike on the estuary, basically keep the salt water out, keep the fresh water in, and use that as the farming area. Well, that was really going to cause an ecological disaster of sorts if you cut off a river from its outflow into Puget Sound. And Brown's farming operation soon failed, but the after effects lingered for over 100 years. Now, after Brown's farm, the river delta and the estuary caught a huge break when in 1974, it was designated as the Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge. And this made the Nisqually one of the only rivers that begins its headwaters in a national park and runs out in a national wildlife refuge. Well, the refuge caught another huge break in 2009, when after years of planning and fundraising, the Nisqually tribe and a big group of partners arranged to remove the dike and to restore the area. And so excavators and crews came in, they removed the nearly 5-mile long dike. They restored over 750 acres of estuary, and they reconnected the delta to its original pathways. So take a look at these before and after pictures. Here's before with the dike still in play, basically running from bottom right to the top left of your photo. And the white circle on the right in the back, that's of the twin barns, just to kind of give you a point of reference. But look inside this yellow oval here, and to compare that with after here, notice now all of the additional pathways that water has to run between the river and Puget Sound. So as I think about, wrapping this up with you and think about all the projects and all the people starting high up on the mountain at Paradise and those great projects there, all these other projects and hardworking people all the way down to the estuary. And I try to think of one person that best represents the grit and the determination of the kind of work that it takes to make the Nisqually River watershed a national model of preservation and restoration. The person I think of as it returns to its natural conditions, I think of Billy Frank Jr. Now, Billy was a Nisqually tribal leader. He was an activist, and his work was so highly regarded that he was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2015. And I think rightly so, the next year, the refuge was renamed the Billy Frank Jr. Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge. And I think that Billy's philosophy, Billy's legacy might best be summed up by one of his quotes, and that is that he said, "I don't believe in magic. I believe in the sun and the stars, the water, the tides, the floods, the owls, hawks flying, the river running, the wind talking, their measurements. They tell us how healthy things are, how healthy we are, because we and they are the same. That's what I believe in. Those who listen to the world that sustains them can hear the message brought forth by the salmon." So, hey, I want to thank you for your attention, for hanging in there and listening well. And if you'd like to pick up a copy of Tahoma and its People, here's a way to do that. Once the visitor centers and the gift shops get reopened, it'll be available there, but we don't know when that will be. So again, I just want to thank you for your time and wish you the very best as you go forward with your season at Mount Rainier. You take care. So long.